Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the philosophy show where we examine very important issues that are either ignored or misrepresented by the mainstream narrative. Hi there, my name's Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to look at the issue of false flag terrorism or state-sponsored terrorism and some alarming implications that you may not be aware of. Most notably, we're going to warn you that you could be breaking the law by funding terrorism if you pay either UK or US taxes. So joining me to discuss this issue is Tony Rooke. Tony is a long-time truth activist and a filmmaker, and amongst his credits are two films we're going to be talking about today. Incontrovertible, which is about the collapse of WTC7, the third building that collapsed on September the 11th of 2001, and also another great film, Death or Taxes, which relates to the 7/7 bombings a few years later. Tony, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Hi Nigel, nice to meet you.
Tony, perhaps you could kick us off with letting us know when did you first sort of become suspicious, if you like, that you couldn't trust the mainstream narrative, couldn't trust the news, couldn't trust your government?
I suppose the first hint I had of it when I was a BBC employee back in 1981-82, during the Falklands War. I didn't work in news. I worked in drama series and serials on programs like Doctor Who and Howard's Way, if you can remember that kind of thing. But I was just a clerk. I was an expenses clerk. I worked for the crew and all that kind of stuff. But a friend of mine worked in news, and I had lunch with him every day. And he said to me that he was a little bit concerned about the stuff they were dumping on the cutting room floor, which is a euphemism, as we all know, for censorship. About some of the stuff our lads were doing in the Falklands. And it was a removal of genitalia of Argentinian conscripts and that kind of thing. And I didn't think too much of it, Nigel. I was quite young, and you don't tend to care about anything apart from yourself when you're that young. But I did speak to a guy who lived next door to me when my parents lived, and he had been to the Falklands, and I mentioned this to him in passing. And he said, yeah, I know guys who have done that. So they were cutting off the private parts of, 16-year-old kids who'd been conscripted by the Argentinian army to go and invade the Falklands. And the BBC had been dumping it on the floor because they thought it would be rather bad information of the British people to know this kind of thing was going on. And then it later came out in the 1990s, about 93, I think, that this kind of thing was happening. And they were war crimes. I'm not being critical of our troops. I know, the fog of war and all that kind of guff. Horrible things happen in war, but that's what was happening. And you would expect an organisation like the BBC to be honest about it, but they weren't.
I gather if we sort of fast forward to your film Incontrovertible, which happens to be about 9/11 and the collapse of Building 7, that sort of links in quite nicely with BBC not becoming clean, because some listeners may be familiar with the fact that Building 7 was reported as collapsed when in fact it was still standing, which is a classic guffaw, with the script being read at the incorrect time, of course, and it the implications are enormous, aren't they, Tony? So how did you get into making the film Incontrovertible? Because it has an interesting take, doesn't it? You're interviewing a lot of the servicemen and women.
Yeah, I mean, I became aware of 9/11, if you like. I woke up to 9/11, as people say. A friend of mine, just a pub buddy of mine, said, "Oh, you like this kind of stuff." I was always very interested in criminology. My father was an ex-forensic detective, and gave me a copy of Loose Change, and so I watched it, and I thought, "Oh, crikey, that's interesting." And then the Building 7 thing, I was very interested in, because that is so blatant. If nobody knows about the third tower who's listening to this broadcast, then I strongly urge them to look into the third tower that went down on 9/11. And what happened was the BBC reported the collapse of that third tower, which was a building called WTC7, or the Salomon Brothers building, which went down at about 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11. It wasn't hit by an aircraft. It wasn't engulfed by any conflagration of flames or anything. It suffered relatively minor fires. and yet it collapsed to the ground from 47 stories to very few piles of rubble in less than 7 seconds. And if you see it, you'll know what I mean. And what happened to me was in around about 2012, I think it was, I'd written to the BBC in 2006 and said, look, can you give me the original source of your story for the collapse of this building? Because what the BBC did on 9/11 was they reported the collapse of the building twice before it occurred. 20 minutes and half an hour before it occurred. In fact, in one broadcast, there was a lady called Jane Stanley, who was a journalist for the BBC, and she had the bloody thing standing behind her out of a window in Manhattan. A lot of people on the internet said, oh, no, it was a green screen. It was, some sort of CGI. It wasn't. And she's admitted that. The building was still standing behind her. So that was very odd. So I wrote to the BBC and said, can you give me the original source of your story that this building had gone down? Who told you it had gone down? And they never told me. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And again, long story short, I stopped paying the license fee then and there. And then in 2012, 6 years later, somebody came around my house and said, well, you haven't paid your TV license. And I said, well, no, I haven't. And these are the reasons why. And I got taken to court and things unfolded from there. So that's
okay.
Where I...
Well, we'll pick up the thread of your court case. But maybe first of all, we can also skip to your other film, Death or Taxes, because so far we've got evidence that the BBC is lying on several counts from what you've said, and I want to tie that in with their complicity with the 7/7 story. Again, I'm going to assume that most people listening to this are probably reasonably familiar with the London bombings of July 7th, 2005, in which 3 tube trains and a bus were blown up, allegedly by 4 Muslim terrorist bombers. And it's interesting because this, your film, Tony, picks up on the story of a previous film, doesn't it? The 7/7 Ripple Effect film by John Hill. Do you want to pick up the story there and perhaps explain how you got interested in his film and why you made your film to do with it? And we can tie that all in with this really interesting court case.
I got interested in the if you like the history, the political history of what you call false flag bombings, which are a very old trick in politics. They're extremely old. They go back to literally pirate days, where a pirate ship would be sailing along, or a ship would be sailing along the high seas. They see an enemy, and they would literally hoist a flag that was maybe friendly to the enemy, so they wouldn't attack them. Or another opposition, and so they could confuse the political narrative. So what happened was a guy called John Hill, who's kind of a friend of mine, I suppose now, but John made a film called 7/7 Ripple Effect, and he had studied the official narrative of the London bombings and found some rather gaping holes in it, to say the least, along with other researchers who had contributed to the film. So we made this movie, and somewhat naively, foolishly, I don't know, sent this film to a judge and jury at a trial linked to the 7/7 bombings. They obviously weren't complicit in the actual event, and we can't prove that the original guys were complicit in the actual event because they're all dead. There's never been a trial on the 7/7 bombings. And John Hill, who made the film, was extradited from his home in Ireland to London and kept in Wandsworth Nick for 150 days, accused of perverting the course of justice because he'd sent this film to a trial linked to the 7/7 bombings. And the government said, well, you can't send a film that accuses the government of being complicit in the 7/7 bombings because it would pervert the course of justice. Anyone seeing this, it's a terrible thing to say. And the BBC hopped on board with this bloody thing and made a whole program called Conspiracy File 7/7 in 2009, saying what an awful man he was, that he'd made this internet film that accused the government of being complicit in the London bombings. So John was shoved in jail. and was put on trial at Southwark Crown Court in 2011, and accused of perverting the course of justice. Now the jury saw his film. This is cutting a long story short. It was a 4-day trial, but having seen his film, the jury turned around and said, "No, you're not guilty." And if you've seen 7/7 Ripple Effect, and I would urge any of your viewers to watch it, which is the first edition, by the way, the first edition, because there's been 2. I would urge them to watch it because the evidence is pretty damn strong that the official story is not as advertised.
I thought you were going to use the word incontrovertible then, but you shied away from it.
No, I'm not that shameless a plugger.
Yeah. So just to clarify a couple of points there for anybody that missed, is that John's film 7/7 Ripple Effect, first edition, very clearly points out some facts which completely undermine the official narrative. I mean, they don't necessarily prove any one person did anything, but what they do prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and with and that's a high degree of certainty, is that the official story is a load of baloney. It's a load of absolute nonsense. And just to give the listeners one quick example, the train that the 4 bombers allegedly caught from Luton to get them to King's Cross, where they separated to do their bombings, was cancelled that morning. The 740 from Luton never ran. So I mean, this is just a flavour of how impossible the whole story is. So this very convincing film is shown to a jury of was it 3 people that were accused? It was in relation to the 7/7 bombings, wasn't it, Tony? Yeah, three men accused of something.
It was a trial at Kingston Crown Court in 2008, I believe, and they were accused of assisting the 7/7 bombers.
Yeah. So John
been accused of being in the back of a cab with explosives, blah 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 blah. Right. But they were actually found not guilty on the initial charge. I think they were found guilty on some other stuff. But John, this is why I say rather foolishly or naively, sent 7/7 Ripple Effect to that trial anonymously.
But
what you call an amicus curiae brief, which is a perfectly legal thing to do, by the way.
Yeah.
But he did it anonymously, which I think was somewhat foolish. But he was extradited from Ireland, and the reasons were, and I've read the extradition papers, was because he said the British government did it. Well, that's not what a British jury thought.
No.
They thought there was fair comment in all that.
So that's quite a massive legal milestone, isn't it, Tony?
It certainly creates reasonable cause, which under the certainly the Terrorism Act of 2000, Section 15, it certainly creates reasonable cause. It doesn't necessarily create law.
But a UK jury is, one of the highest authorities in the land. I mean, it's right up there.
It should be the highest benchmark of guilt or innocence that we have.
And a jury in the UK pronounced this film as being, I mean, I'm using my own words here. I'm not pronounced it as being fair game, a fair assessment.
Yeah, effectively fair comment.
Yeah, fair comment.
It was not going to pervert. It would not lead to an injustice. If you go by the extradition papers, this film would not lead to an injustice by saying. And if you've seen the film, and I'd urge your listeners to watch the film, because it is very, very clear in what it says. It says our lot did it.
Yeah. And
the jury said, yeah, fair comment.
It's a fascinating film, isn't it? I mean, it does very cleverly by showing all of the actual facts that can't really be disputed. And it does it very rationally, and it sets out everything that we know and what we've been told, and just shows it to be a complete fabrication. And the interesting thing is that the BBC still cling to this official narrative. The official story is still on the BBC website to this day. I checked just recently, and they still cling to this story, which is known to be a fabrication. So perhaps you can, which is massive in itself. It just proves that the BBC are liars for all the other reasons you've mentioned as well. But maybe you can draw in, your experience at refusing to pay your TV license, and also the implications for taxes. You mentioned the Terrorist Act of 2005 there. Can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, you have to understand the Terrorism Act of 2000, which is, if you go to Section 15, which is on financing, and you can look it up on the internet. Any one of your friends can go to Section 15, Terrorism Act 2000, and you drag it down on the PDF, and it will go to financing. And I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember it word for word, but if you, anybody has reasonable cause to believe you are furthering the purposes of terrorism with your money, you can't pay. It's an offence. It's a serious offence. It's a very serious offence. And there are various events in British law that have happened that would give us reasonable cause to think we have breached this code, if you like. We have furthered the purposes of terrorism. I mean, if you want to look it up, Regina versus Gul, Gul, who was a Muslim gentleman who was doing some research on the internet and got prosecuted. But the result of that in the Supreme Court ruling, and I'm going back to, oh, golly gosh, just put in Regina versus Gul, Gul. Mm-hmm. One of the final rulings in that case was even the quasi-military involvement of the British in the Middle East using military activity falls under the definition of terrorism. So even on that case alone, we should start asking questions about where our taxes are going. Absolutely. I think it was Lord Neuberger turned around and said, no, even British involvement in the Middle East, even with or without, and that's in the ruling, the approval of the British government is terrorism. So hang on a minute, we're funding terrorism, even on that one. So you can even move forward to the John Hill case. A jury verdict is reasonable cause. One of the interesting things that came out last year, Nigel, in 2008, July 2018, it was Regina versus Letts. And it was a couple, you may remember them, Mr. and Mrs. Letts. One of them was, such a severe, nasty criminal. He was an organic farmer. His wife was a charity worker. And they had sent some money to their son, which the press labelled Jihadi Jack. It was absolute bollocks. Saying that, they sent them some money to their son who was out in the Middle East. I mean, their son had gone over to the Middle East in his confusion as a teenager. And probably got mixed up with some people he shouldn't have got mixed up with. All they wanted to do was to get him out of there. They just wanted to get him out, like you would, I would, whatever, with their teenage son. Get them out of there. And even the British press described the prosecution as inhumane. You can look this up, Regina versus Letts, Mr. and Mrs. Letts. Mm-hmm. And the government invoked the Terrorism Act 2000, Section 15 to 17, the financing of terrorism, and prosecuted these people for sending him money to get him out of Syria. So, okay, fine, we'll do that. That's absolutely fine. But if it doesn't work the other way round, that's when you know you live in fascism. Yeah. Now, the thing with that case was it was interesting because Parliament handed down a directive to prosecute these people. And so what we've done is, with Section 15 to 17 of the Terrorism Act, we've actually removed the burden of proof. You only have to have suspicion of terrorism to be found guilty of it. If you think, God forbid one of your kids buggered off to the Middle East and got mixed up with some people who are vaguely shady, who may be pissed off about us bombing the crap out of them. If you sent them some money, that could be used for them. Even though you're trying to get them out of there, if you send them money, that could be used for them. Okay, fine. If you're going to use this criteria under the Terrorism Act, well, let us use that criteria as well. Let us use the London bombings. Let us use Building 7 or 9/11. Let us use, et cetera, et cetera. But the government thus far have never been challenged on this. They're going to be challenged on it shortly, by the way.
It is interesting, isn't it? It's a sort of a flexible legislation that obviously can be used to construct a case where needed. And I'm quite sure, as you pointed out, something to do with fascism there. I'm quite sure that if you or I did try, I mean, maybe somebody should try that. It obviously, does suggest that to try mounting a legitimate case to withdraw holding taxes until some kind of at least some kind of investigation is done, and this sort of brings us quite tidily to Tony Blair's refusal to have an investigation, and it kind of echoed the same sort of excuse that George Bush was using on the other side of the Atlantic a few years previously, in that we already know what's happened, and if we have an investigation into our own into the government forces, if we do that, we're going to be taking resources away from people that should be chasing the terrorists, etc., etc. I mean, you've got a great clip of it in the film. It's in Incontrovertible, I believe. But I mean, it's shocking, isn't it? We have to remind ourselves that these false flag terrorist attacks, and there's stacks of evidence. I'm sure people have seen the films, but there'll be links below. There's stacks of evidence which it must be understood clearly disproves the official narrative. And that's really all you need, ladies and gentlemen. You don't need to know everything about what happened and how they did it. This is a nonsense. You just need to know that someone's a liar and they're talking baloney, and everything else follows from that. And there's so many, the fact that in your film, Tony, you got perfect footage of the tower, or the building, I should say, falling down again and again, perfectly in on its own footprint. A nice little crimp at the top. Textbook controlled demolition. We know that controlled demolitions take weeks to set up. The idea that that building fell down in the afternoon due to some fires is just obviously nonsense to anyone with a brain.
I don't want to withhold taxes and have the NHS collapse, or the infrastructure collapse of this country. I don't want to do that. I understand how taxes are important.
No, it's just the issue of them being used to fund terrorism.
Yeah, and the law is very, very clear. It doesn't matter. Even if it's 1 penny going towards terrorism, you can't pay it. It's what you call fungible money. So the facts are, whether you like it or not, I don't know how much you pay council tax where you live. I mean, you've got a yurt, and you probably pay thousands. I don't know. I don't have a yurt. So I mean, I pay like 70 quid a month council tax. If a penny of that is going towards terrorism, can you imagine a guy standing on the street saying, fund your local paedophile? Would you give him any money? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't give it to him if he was funding terrorism. You wouldn't do it. It's an iniquitous thing. It's a bad thing. So the fact of the matter is, and it is a fact, that when you give some money to your local council, some of that will go to what they call the consolidated fund. I've done a little film on this. It's called Death or Taxes. I've got the letters from the Inland Revenue that will prove it to you. Some of the money will go to the consolidated fund, and some of that will go to the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah, I think it's worth sort of just tying that back in to this sort of justification for war, because you mentioned it in film Controvertible. This sort of, or rather, an ex-Marine chap you were interviewing did. I think it's this continuous justification for continuous war, and it was the George Bush's sort of cue for sort of getting in there. Was 9/11, and then Tony Blair needed to jump on board with moral support, so he needed an event in London. And when you examine these issues and you see that they're completely false, and you combine that with the fact that they don't want an inquest, it's justification of a war. This is evil. This is serious. This is about as serious as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, in the old days, you can go back to World War II, and there were Polish guys, Polish intellectuals from universities over there, and they developed a phrase, and it was called a word which you can actually look up. It's called ponerology, and it was the evil within politics.
We tend to, finger abusive parents as evil, and rightly so. And part of their evil is a sort of a reign of terror over children, abusing children in whatever shape or form. Yeah. And the fact that the children are in this vulnerable position, looking up to their guardians. and it's a sort of a parallel situation with citizens looking up, unfortunately, in error and in ignorance, looking up to their governments to to look after them, to protect them. That's what the armed forces are there for, to protect us from foreign invasion. And to have this trust completely betrayed with these false flag events that are used simply to manipulate people into coming on board. I mean, it's about as bad as it gets. I can't think of anything worse.
These are the people in charge. Do you trust them? And unfortunately, Nigel, a lot of people do. And I live in Chichester, which is the most pro-Tory conclave you can think of. It's absolutely moronic. And it is. I mean, I listen to them in supermarkets every day. I go spare here every 5 minutes, but I don't try to go out too much, because otherwise I kill someone. But that's where I live, and that is the mentality here, that we believe, the local Tory MP. I mean, it's just absolute madness. They don't even know that a third tower went down on 9/11. They know nothing about the 7/7 bombings. They don't know about Operation Northwards. They don't know about Tonkin. They don't know about Liberty. They don't know anything about political history, and yet they go and vote.
We do have a huge educational challenge before us, because I think, for there to be any hope at all, this conversation needs to be had. People need to get talking. They need to get interested. They need to start educating themselves. But as we all know, this is a fringe interest. Self-education is a fringe interest today.
It is. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
So it's very difficult to know what to do. But hopefully we're contributing something to spreading some useful information. And at the risk of repeating myself, I think the fact that we can't trust our governments in this context, we have to be concerned about paying legitimate taxes as to what atrocity could that be funding next. And this is really as bad as it gets. There should be some kind of collective action or mass action.
I don't think we can trust our government in any context.
No,
we can't trust them in education. We can't trust them in education. And why would you trust a government that allows this to educate your children at high school, or I mean, I remember going back to the 1970s, 1980s. Nobody taught me about this kind of stuff.
No,
I should have been taught about Operation Northwards in 1962. I should have been taught about that.
Was Operation Northwards, was that the issue with the proposal to draw Cuba into a conflict by bombing locations in Miami, and then the Americans,
parts of the American military-industrial complex went to JFK and said, we want to bomb Washington, we want to bomb Florida, we want to blow up aircraft, we want to blow up ships, and then blame it on Cuba. It's what you call a false flag narrative, and we want to do that. And that's it's not a new concept. It wasn't a new concept then. And JFK, more for him, I suppose you could argue, said, no, we're not going to do that. And then he was dead a year later.
George Bush was denying, I mean, we know that he's an idiot anyway. I couldn't believe he was sort of puppet president that he was. But when he was sort of giving his excuse, how could anybody think of blowing buildings up with airplanes? And he had this mock pretend shock sort of speech one time I remember seeing him give. And when you bear in mind things like Operation Northwards, it's just nonsense, isn't it? I mean, these people are just barefaced liars.
Even the BBC have covered Operation Northwards. Even the BBC have it on their website. You can go there and look it up. Although the BBC describe it as, I'm paraphrasing, looking at the alternative options for invading. I mean, they don't describe it as the false flag that it is, because the BBC are like that. But when you look into 9/11, 9/11 is far worse than Operation Northwards. The information we have now on 9/11 far outstrips that. If you look at people like Richard Clarke, who was the head of counter-terrorism, he turns around and says, we knew where these guys were. They were in a hotel. We knew where they were, but the CIA didn't tell us. I mean, it was all withheld information. It's, Michael Springman, who was in charge of passports in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. These guys shouldn't have been allowed in. They were given a red carpet into the country. And then you look at Building 7, and then you look at the bombs that were going off in the Twin Towers, before they went down. William Rodriguez, people like that. It's crazy, Nigel. It's absolutely crazy.
It is, and as you said, there's probably a small community of people that sort of already know about a lot of these things. There are some excellent films, and they will be the links below. There are plenty of resources these days to anyone who is curious to educate themselves to the point where they are satisfied that it's a certainty that their government is lying to them. And you can reach this level of certainty, ladies and gentlemen. You absolutely can. As I said, you don't need to work out every minute detail of who was responsible. But when you watch a controlled demolition happening, and there is lots of footage on the internet, you can look at controlled demolitions all day long, and then come and look at particularly Building 7, as you illustrate in your film, but also the Twin Towers. But it's more obvious. It's 100% obvious on World Trade Center 7 building, with this beautiful designed free fall, and how NIST, the various official agencies, can even sort of dispute that it fell at free fall speed, and all these other things, and the other nonsense about the Twin Towers. One of the major take-home points is that people need to be aware that if they met a liar in their village or in their community, if they knew somebody was an evil person, was beat people up, robber, liar, you would treat them appropriately. You would shun them. They would be ostracized. You would not chummy up to them and help them out. You would, when you know that you're dealing with a liar, you act appropriately. We do. We know that. And what we have to remember is that when we know, and we've seen the BBC and other news outlets as well, being prepared to lie again and again and again, and governments lying, we have to factor that in to everything we hear from them. And I think one of the unfortunate things is that these sorts of issues, false flag terrorism, governments lying, can be compartmentalized away into our minds somewhere and sort of effectively parked out of sight and forgotten about. But we have to remember that we're dealing with an institution, not necessarily individuals, but individuals lie as well. Tony Blair lied. But we're dealing with an institution that's got a tragic track record of lying to us. And, how do you go forward with that? How do you interact with an entity that you know is lying to you?
This system has not worked. And there is a reason why it hasn't worked. And I would encourage people to maybe just scratch a little bit at the surface and look at it. And they don't. Unfortunately, what we have is every 4 years, or whenever it is, we have a general election. You have these people get worked up into this fervour of red, orange and blue, but they don't really think about what they're voting for. I don't mean to sound patronising, but, well, I'm going to sound patronising, tough shit. But they don't really think about what they're voting for, and what they're voting for is more of the same.
I think it's rather futile, really, to keep voting for government. I think, a lot of people out there appreciate that it's just a sort of like a Punch and Judy show, and there are sort of other hands, should we say, sort of calling the tune behind the scenes. When you look into those Twin Towers and you find that evidence of thermite being used and sort of temperatures of hundreds of degrees, sort of months after the collapse of the buildings, all of these sort of things, these facts of reality that can't be explained away, they really are strong leverage, if you like, in understanding that the official story is nonsense. And then, as I said earlier, we have to sort of make the deductions and implications. We have to bring them to our consciousness, the implications. Well, if that is nonsense and that's nonsense, well, then what does that mean? That means that all of this stuff's nonsense. And
I will be going to court shortly with Her Majesty's government over 9/11. Because I don't want to pay my council tax, and so I will be using the Terrorism Act, maybe in February, and saying I don't want to pay you because of the case last year, which I think I referred to earlier on in the interview, of the government against Mr. and Mrs. Letts.
Yes.
Because in that prosecution, if you can cast your mind back 50 minutes,
yes,
the government did say to Mrs. Letts, you can't turn a blind eye to this. There's no excuse. You can't turn a blind eye. So I'm going to take them at their word, and I'm going to turn around and say, well, I don't want to pay your council tax because I don't want to turn a blind eye to this. This is my evidence. And what will happen, Nigel, I can guarantee you, is they'll turn around and say, well, we don't care, and bugger off. And that's what happens under fascism.
Indeed, which, if that
but
does...
if everyone did it, that will make a difference.
Yeah, if that does turn out to be the case, and no pun intended there, if that turns out to happen, that, you're given the cold shoulder or you're not taken seriously, then that is just another piece of proof. Well, Tony, look, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this issue with us today. Really appreciate that. I think it's very, very important, and I do hope that listeners will draw their own conclusions, appropriate, rational, logical conclusions, inescapable conclusions even. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Really appreciate your story, Tony.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, Nigel.
And thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I do urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more there on finding truth, how to thrive. There's health stuff, all sorts of really good information. Thank you very much for listening, and join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to